Hi there. So, I recently did a video on Dave Chappelle, and to my delight, my conversation partner, the brilliant Christopher Mastropietro, got in touch with me and said that perhaps we should discuss this a little bit more. So, this is what we're doing. And I really want to emphasize how thoughtful Christopher's analysis about Dave Chappelle's form, his format, and his material is. And I think that this is one of the better analyses you're going to see in Christopher's analysis. So thanks for joining me, and I'm honored to present my conversation with Christopher Mastropietro on the topic of Dave Chappelle. Hi, Christopher. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. It's been a while.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
Well, that last talk I had with you did really well. Everyone was really interested in it. And of course, that classic, the classic smoking story. We had so much good response. So,
it was great. It was lovely to do. That's always lovely to talk to you.
You too. So we're going to talk about a smoker today, someone who in his act generally has a cigarette in his hand and recently a vape in his hand. So we're going to talk about Dave Chappelle and our common interest.
Yeah. I love that segue, by the way. That was a beautiful way of connecting the thread, the smoking. I actually hadn't thought, of all the things I've been thinking about with Dave Chappelle, and there have been many, the smoking was one I actually didn't have in mind to talk about today, but boy, how appropriate is that?
Well, it's just you see it so rarely anymore. I mean, you do see people vaping sometimes, and even that you don't see as much, but smoking you rarely see. So it's just something that sets him apart among other things.
It does. And he actually makes a point of smoking. He makes a point of flouting the prohibition by taking his cigarettes on stage with him. And he even did it. I think my favorite example of this is when he got, I think it was a couple of years ago, he got the Mark Twain Humorist Prize in DC. And have you seen that?
No, I can't. I didn't. I wish I had. I wish I'd done a deeper dive into his stuff because I will watch that now.
Yeah, that's okay. There's so much of it, but this is all to say they do sort of it's a special. They do it every year for some comedian or another. It's on Netflix actually. I think that special is on Netflix. That sort of that awards ceremony, because they basically round up a bunch of comedians to do bits about the honoree. And then the honoree comes up and accepting the award and basically gives a little speech. And his speech is fantastic. It's very characteristic of him. It's sort of half comedic and half, narrativity. Yeah. You know what I mean? And that's sort of very much his signature. His comedy is in a formal blend of narrative, and it unfolds that way, right? And so that one is no different. But he takes a cigarette on stage and he shows, by the way, look at me. Everyone look at me smoking indoors. I didn't ask anybody. I just did it. This is called leverage, right?
Absolutely.
And maybe we can talk about, because I think there's something very symbolically important about that. So maybe we can get into that at some point. But this is all to say it's a great little bit.
Well, I think I like what you said about his, his combination of narrative and comedy, because it reminds me a lot of how Pirsig describes the Chautauqua.
Right. It is very much, isn't it? And I think of it very much as a kind of formal seduction on the part of Chappelle, because what he does is he gives, he naturalizes the comedy into the subjective character of experience, right? The conscious character of experience. And he integrates the humor into that experience so that it doesn't seem something apart, something external, something that's in any way divorced or dissociated from that subjective character, he actually integrates it. And I think that there's something about the narrative form that's crucial to that, to the seductive quality of it. Because you're being set up for jokes that you have no concept that you're being set up for in a narrative, right? All you're doing is just following the beats of the story. And then suddenly, after about 4 or 5 minutes, you realize that the entire story has been one long setup for a punchline that seems inevitable when it happens, but it's entirely surprising when it does. And so there's something, I really think that there's a kind of Socratic seduction in that form. And he seems to have it perfected to a degree that I think is very rare. So it's not simply the comedy that's the virtuosic quality, it's the storytelling, it's the oratory.
So tell me more about the Socratic seduction. I don't know what that is, and so how he sort of parallels that.
Well, I think so. One of the things that he does is, he begins, just as Socrates does at the beginning of a dialogue, he begins to play into the conventions, the presumptive conventions of the interlocutor. In his case, his interlocutor is the entire audience. But crucially, if you sort of look at him closely when he's doing his stand-up, he looks at individuals. He looks at people, something Peterson talks about, which is interesting, right?
Something Peterson does too. I mean, if you watch Peterson lectures, he does the same thing.
Totally. Yeah, that's right. Peterson talks about the difference between looking at someone, at an individual, and looking at a mass and a crowd. Because when you look at an individual, you're always attending to the individual and you're always tending to the comprehension of the individual. You're speaking into the individual's ear rather than into a mass. And so that because of that, you allow for kind of texture and subtlety that a mass could not possibly accommodate. And so if you look at him doing a stand-up, he always speaks to the audience as though it's a single person. He doesn't talk at them, he talks to them. And before any of the content becomes relevant, that form frames the nature of that interaction. Okay, so his interlocutor is the entire audience. And what he does is he'll set up a joke using all of the premises that one would expect, all of the premises that play into the expectations of that audience, right? They're sort of conventional values. They're all of the moralizations of the day. He begins by sort of feeding into them, by getting everyone on side, by making sure that everyone's playing within the same arena, understanding things on the same terms. And then what he'll do is he'll suddenly change the arena. He'll suddenly subvert it so that you thought that you were being set up for one thing, and it turns out that you were being set up for something very different, right? It's almost as though he leads people somewhere and then he disappears and then he appears at the back of the crowd like a magician and goes, see, I've actually been here this whole time. And that's very much what Socrates does, right? He, premise by premise by premise, he questions his interlocutors until the sum of their beliefs in a very egoic way is sort of tallied. And then ultimately he makes this move where he sets himself and his framing and his inquiry in such a way that all of those premises that have been stacking up and accumulating are suddenly orthogonal to the point, right? They suddenly amount to an inadequate formulation of whatever problem is being teased. And that sudden shift, that pivot, that sudden reformulation of a problem or reformulation of a character of experience, I think is one of the bases of his humor. And it's the surprise of it.
That makes so much sense. And that was so beautiful, the way you described that. And I think that what you were saying, where he's evoking or seducing you into this subjective experience with himself, he is the person playing, he is the story, maybe this happened to him, maybe it didn't, but you certainly believe that it did.
Right. Exactly. He's always playing himself and he's always playing a character, right? Everything is real and everything is not at the same time. And that's where his irony comes into play. One of the things that I find so incredibly beautiful and galvanizing about his comedy is that his irreverence is born from reverence. It's very clear that this is a very serious person. Only by being so serious could he be as funny as he is. Only by having a deep sense of the sacred could his profanity be so effective. I think it's one of the things that distinguishes a really, and those qualities I think are qualities of any great humorist, in my opinion. The great humorists they're always undergirded by an attention to the sacred, and it's fundamental. It's at the bedrock of their routines. And yet their irreverence, ironically, is to draw attention to what is sacred by becoming disruptive, so again, Socratically disruptive to the conventional values that are taken as presumed at any given moment in time, right? And so I think that one of the things he does is he uses these little humorous lines of inquiry to provoke an unconscious and very spontaneous reaction to flouting those conventions and values to see what surfaces. And in so doing, he kind of presents, if I can sort of put it just sort of in superficially in sort of Jungian terms for a moment, he presents, he evokes, conjures up, and then represents the shadow to people, right? That emerges in the course of his routine. One of my favorite examples of this.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you for an example.
Oh, there are so many of them. There are so many of them. One of my favorite examples of this is in one of his specials. It's in Sticks and Stones, which was the first of his I actually saw. I was very late to the Chappelle party. He was very, very big. His show was really popular when I was younger, and at the time, I was just into other things, and it went over my head. And then a couple of years ago, a friend said, "Hey, you need to watch this special." And so there's a bit when he goes, and again, this is the performative contradiction here, right? He's talking about sort of the whole cancel culture thing, and he's talking about Michael Jackson, and he says, and again, whether he believes this or not is completely besides the point, right? But he says, I'm going to say something that I'm not allowed to say, right? He's going to formulate something that is unspoken, but obviously present, right? And that's what he does, right? He takes something that is part of people's subjective character, and he allows it to be consciously formulated so that it becomes properly present and then can be interrogated, right? So he says, I'm going to say something I'm not allowed to say. I don't believe it. I don't believe these people, meaning those alleged victims of Michael Jackson's pedophilia. And he says, I don't believe it. I don't believe that he did it. But you know what? Even if he did do it, you know what I mean? Now, I remember laughing very, very hard when he did that, because it was so unexpected, because just that gesture, he didn't have to say anything. Now, there's sort of two reactions to that, and they happen simultaneously in the audience if you're listening. One is a gasp, because that's anathema, right? I mean, if there's anything that is anathema, it's pedophilia. In our culture. So there's a collective gasp, people are horrified, and there's uproarious laughter, because there's so much implied by that shrug, right? And so what he's doing is he's taking something that goes unquestioned, right? A kind of conventional morality that goes absolutely unquestioned, and maybe justly so, but again, not the point, right? He takes something that's so presumed and that somehow sediments our normativity as a culture. It's one of those fundaments, right? And he literally shrugs it off to see what happens when he shrugs it off. And he does it in this sort of very unassuming, sort of like, almost as though he's been sitting thinking about it and just doesn't quite get it, he does. There's another example of that. It's in the same special where he's talking about guns, sort of gun culture.
That's right, yeah.
Is one of my favorite jokes of his, and I think it kind of passes by. A lot of people miss it, but it's very, very funny. And he's saying, he's speaking into the mind of a liberal. He's speaking into a liberal ear, often in his specials, and he says, I hate guns, I can't stand them. Of course, it's a liberal audience. Everyone cheers. He goes, yeah, but I have several, right? And what he's doing there, obviously, is he's showing that there's a dissonance. There's a fundamental dissonance in the person, a dissonance that amounts to a performative contradiction, right, between the ideological postures in the presentation of self, right? The way we relate to one another in a shared commons and espouse certain kinds of normative conventions and rules that we take to be implicit. And the instincts and those drives and more secretive apprehensions that tend to be far more efficacious in driving our behavior, right? And his jokes constantly do this. They constantly do this, right? Where he'll frame something around the shared convention and then show that he himself cannot fully conform to it because there's a certain baseness in him that simply can't be accommodated by it, right? So there's this fundamental dissonance, this rupture in the person, and he sets himself up as the fool that constantly falls prey to that contradiction, the man who puffs his chest out and proclaims self-righteously, and who at the same time, while doing that, slips on a banana peel and falls backwards, and shows that for all of this grandstanding, he's not so sure on his feet after all, you know. And he is often the butt of that, right? He sets himself up as the exemplar for that problem. It's not as though he outsources the problem. He really takes it onto himself, right?
Absolutely.
So that's just to sort of begin. That's one kind of way in which he sets himself. I'll just say one more thing about that. I mean, another thing that he often does, and he has versions of this jokes that run all through his specials, where he will recount a story that involves him taking some kind of moral position on something, a very serious moral position. You know, there's a joke like that when he's victim of a racist slur and gets hit with a snowball, and, you know, has this very long story about going to the police station and meeting the mother of the young man who hit him with a snowball. And he basically sets it up so that he can become, you know, he can take this position of pontificating to this woman whose son had this sort of racist gesture toward him. And he's setting it up so that you think he's about to have this very, very serious conversation with this woman where he'll be magnanimous and demonstrate, you know, his capacity to be enlightened, sort of, and in accord with the spirit of the times. And all it is just a setup for a sexual joke, right? That's all of this moralizing is just one huge setup for him to express that all of this was being propelled by a resentful and sexual appetite.
And that joke, what's so brilliant about that particular joke is it comes, you know, he says at the beginning, I would love to integrate this joke into my work. And then he ends up, the whole special ends with that, I believe. Is that right?
Which special?
Or it really is, I think it might be the end, or that particular joke. It's a brilliant, because he goes through the whole machinations of the whole hour. And then there's that joke. He's integrated it. Exactly.
That's right.
It's almost as if he set up the whole special even.
Yes. It often feels that way, doesn't it?
Yes.
You're right. And he does that a lot.
So
he has like
beautifully orchestrated.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So I wanted to, it's interesting, the things you've brought up were things I was thinking about as well, because when he was talking about the Michael Jackson incident, one thing, through the Pirsigian lens, one thing about, and I mentioned this in my video, is that we are, you know, and let's just say his audience is of a particular social class in general, you know, educated liberals for the most part. Maybe, you know, he's going to be someone who integrates people, and that's what we hope, and that's what it seems like he's trying to do. But let's just say for, you know, for simplicity, that's his audience. And so his audience does have that type of intellectual posturing, which means in the Pirsigian sense that they are living out intellectual ideas. And this is a big problem in that particular class, is that they're mistaking intellectual concepts for they think that they can take these idealized intellectual concepts about social functioning and social reaction and the way things should be in society, and act them out and live them. But the problem is, since we are, these social patterns don't die. They're still there, and we can't repress or suppress them with an intellectual idea that is more morally, the intellectual level is more moral. These ideas are the moral, let's just say, ideals of these social patterns, but the social patterns are still there, and we still have to contend with them, and this is how they are. And a lot, I think, of what he's doing is calling out those social patterns that we pretend aren't there, that this particular elite audience pretend isn't there, that they pretend and virtue signal and have identified with these intellectual patterns of idealized social behavior, when in fact that social behavior is operating in all of us, because it's very old. And even more so, you have also more on the biological social end of that level. We still have that behavior too, so, and it's interesting, in the Michael Jackson episode, there is this, this great intellectual emergence of anti-pedophilia, and thank God for that, because, but the fact of the matter is that for most of human history, that wasn't a thing.
Right.
I mean, things were happening to kids a lot during human history. And then he says, and these 14-year-old, gay boys might very well put themselves on purpose into this situation with people like, Kevin Spacey.
Right. That's right.
I mean, maybe a girl, it would be something totally different, and that might be, even on the social level, something that's kind of problematic and unacceptable. But the fact of the matter is, even to this day, you've probably got, young gay boys coming out of the closet who do put themselves in that situation and aren't, this is very controversial for me to say, but, he's saying maybe they're not even harmed by this.
Yeah.
Because it's our intellectual notion that any kind of act like that is going to be a bad thing psychologically for a person. And he's saying, well, maybe not,
That's right. That's right.
So he's calling out the actual social patterns that still exist, despite the fact that we're trying to shut them down with these intellectual ideas. And another thing that you were saying, in terms of his engaging us in this subjective self, that is sort of like, he uses the N word in a really interesting way to refer to people. And that N word is the everyman.
Yes, that's why he uses it for everyone. He calls it, he calls everybody by that word.
Yes.
Whomever they are, however old, young, ethnicity, race, gender, he calls everybody that. I mean, and that speaks to your point beautifully.
Word for women, but it's the same thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. He uses it, primarily in reference to men. That's true. But yes, as the everyman, I like that. I think that's right. I think that's exactly right.
And that everyman is that person you were describing, the one who goes into a situation with this identity that is, this lofty identity, and slips on the banana peel. I mean, that's the N word. That's what we all, that's the, we all have Christmas cards, like we all have Elaine Christmas cards.
Yeah. That's right. It's the ultimate, it's the humiliation of the ego, right? And that's really what he's after. And his own first among them. His own first among them. I really like the way you put that. It's like he's showing that there are contradictions between these levels, as you put it.
And this is the real Pirsigian thing. I mean, who says that these patterns are there, they still exist. No amount of intellectuality is going to get rid of them, as much as you pretend, and the intellectual level tries to cut itself off and dismiss all of this. And that's what he's digging up. He's saying, you can do this all you want. You can do this day and night, but this stuff is still there, and this is how it is. Right.
That's right. Because by showing that the way that these, we can't, there is no perspective. And that's one of the things that he's showing us, that perhaps not that there is no such perspective, but whatever perspective there could be that could somehow be inclusive of both of those levels that could harmonize them together is precisely the perspective that eludes us and eludes his audience. And what he's doing is he's pronouncing this deep kind of disharmony and the ignorance of that disharmony that becomes manifest in these performative contradictions. Right? When we say one thing and do another, believe one thing and act in opposition, profess something and subvert it when our own intentions and motives simply are at variance with it. And this happens again and again and again and again and again. And it's this real deep ignorance of self, I think.
Exactly.
And he finds to be the object of the humor, even his own ignorance, right? And he does it all the time. You know, there's one in his latest special, a moment where he, you know, he's talking about being in a bar and being accosted. And he's saying, you know, and I love the way he always does this mock ironic grandstanding where he refers to himself in the third person as though he's some kind of, you know, he refers to himself as a character, you know, as Dave Chappelle. And he describes someone coming over and goading him into conflict. And he says, well, these people thought this was my first rodeo, that I'd never dealt with someone who was trying to accost me. Do they not know that I'm wiser than this? Do they not know that I've been through this for years and years and years? And then he pauses and he goes, but sadly it worked. I was goaded. Right. And the variance of that joke, propound, because they're trying to open up that gap. They're trying to pry open the space where that dissonance can be fundamentally found, you know. And yeah, so I like this that somehow he's showing the disharmony between these levels. He's showing the disharmony between these levels. And so one thing that I also wanted to kind of touch on is the fact that he ultimately, I think that, and this is of someone like him, this would perhaps be a controversial thing to say for anyone who's not paying close attention to him. And I think anyone who is paying close attention to him understands that when he's referring to himself, like that everything he does is dripping with irony, and that the attitude he takes in relation to the content of his speech is actually the object of the joke, not the content of the speech itself, because he's becoming conscious of his own dissonance, even as he describes his own activity and conduct. And it's his own puzzled reaction to that dissonance that's actually the object of the humor. It's almost as though as he falls, he's becoming conscious of the fall, and he's drawing everyone's attention to it. And he's using the narrative form as a seductive method to get everyone to fall with him and trace out the motion. And there's something very religious going on here. Religious in the sense that Kierkegaard talks about this a lot, that humor in some ways is that the seriousness of religious orientation, and Dave Chappelle is explicitly religious. He refers to himself that way. Not so much in his specials, but if you sort of hear or read or listen to anything else about him, that becomes very clear very quickly. And it makes me think of how the seriousness of religious orientation is expressed paradoxically by humor, because it prevents dogmatization, it prevents idolatry, and it prevents and it humiliates the ego. I've said, and there's an example of this that Kierkegaard gives in one of his books of just that we've given already, which is this person who looks up at the sky, lofty, ambitious, looking for the theosis, right? And falls as he's looking up at the sky, right? Like that old fable about Thales, the philosopher Thales, who's looking up, at the sky to try and chart the stars, and falls into a well as he's looking up at the sky. And there's something in that symbolic, simultaneous motion of looking up, being drawn up, right? This sort of tending to the infinite, and the absolute decrepitude of not being able to keep one's own self upright.
Yes.
Right? And losing one's feet. And I think in some ways that symbolic contradiction, that simultaneous motion up and the fall together, is what Chappelle incarnates in himself and draws consciousness to, because he's doing both simultaneously, right? He's drawing himself up. He's trying to gather a sense of normativity, of valuation, right? Of a transcendent sort. And he's also showing that the fundamental baseness, the inadvertent baseness and wickedness and pettiness, that's ultimately part of an indispensable part of his own character, will always undermine that motion. And so that simultaneous gaze skyward and the slip backward is something like a kind of symbolic expression of that fundamental sense of paradox, that fundamental contradiction in the person.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because you will listen to him, he'll start on a, let's just say the Chautauqua kind of riff, which is sort of going in the direction of current social morals. And we'll go, and then you'll say, wow, I'm very impressed that he's going in that direction. That's, and you get your heart becomes warm and you respect him, and you're going, this is kind of odd. I mean, so here he is, he's going to be a mouthpiece for these social values, and we can kind of get on board with that because that's how we want to identify. And then he'll do exactly what you said. He'll fall.
That's right.
Yeah, he'll slip and fall. And
That's
bring
right.
himself down to the decrepitude of, these imperfect beings that we are, that are never going to, we're never going to reach the stratosphere. We're just going to always be looking up.
That's right. Because those imperfections, that kind of moral decrepitude is a part of us that cannot be wished away or willed away or done away with hastily. It has to somehow be accommodated. It has to be given its space, and it has to become incorporated in order to defer to the fundamental mystery of that same paradox. Because there's something very mysterious about that combination, right? That combination of virtue and failure that we seem just not able to synthesize anymore. We have no gift anymore in our culture, right, for synthesizing those traits, right? And that's very well, we know why, we have a good sense of why that's the case. We've been talking about it for a while now. But just sort of focusing on this for a second, one of the jokes to this effect that I particularly like is when he's talking about abortion, and he says, I can't remember how it comes up in one of his specials, but he makes two moves with it, and these are really, really good moves. The first move is to show the effective performative contradiction between the profession of value and the personal and the intrinsic self-interest, right? So he says, I have to tell you, I'm not for abortion. And then there's a reaction. He goes, I'm not for it, and I'm not against it either. It all depends on who I get pregnant. Right? So that's the first thing he does. Okay, again, there's the performative contradiction in himself. And then what he does is he shifts the performative contradiction now onto the culture. And he says, listen, if you're a man, you need to shut up about this, right? This is theirs, referring to women. This is theirs. The right to choose is their unequivocal right. And I don't believe that they should have to consult anybody as to how they exercise that right, except for a physician who can help them to execute it. Gentlemen, that's fair. Please shut the hell up about it and just let them decide. Of course, there's a big cheer. And then he says, and ladies, to be fair to us, meaning men, he says, I also believe that if you choose to keep the baby, a man should not have to pay. He says, if you can kill this kid, I can at least abandon him. That is fair. And then he says, if that's wrong, then maybe we're wrong. And that's crucial to me, right? Because what he's showing is that not only is there's this this dilemma that hangs over this issue has to do with it having been so poorly formulated, so poorly framed. And the humor is the absurdity of the formulation that we've all taken for granted. And by showing the fact that the formulation, the working formulation, is absurd and paradoxical, he's not only drawing humor from it, and he's getting a very instinctive reaction from people, but he's shifting the way that the issue is framed in the first place. And of course, it ends aphoretically. Very Socratic. It ends aphoretically. He goes, well, if that's wrong, then maybe we're wrong. Figure this out for yourselves. I don't know what the answer is to this, but I know that the way we've conceived this fundamentally doesn't do any of us any service, because we're pitting values and virtues against one another without understanding their proper order and sequence. It's a fundamental incoherence that is providing this problem, right? It's because we've misframed it in the first place.
Yeah.
And so many of his jokes have to do with revealing, and it's not just him, right? It's any really good humorist like him. I think so much of what they're doing is they are pronouncing the implicit absurdity in positions that try to pair levels of reality that cannot fundamentally paired in the way that they have alleged to be, if that makes any sense.
It makes a lot of sense, because I think that is where, you've got that we're going into this issue with this theoretical understanding of it. And what he's slowly revealing, beginning with the first dilemma, which is, how can you be for it and how can you be against it? Because you can certainly, no matter where you are ideologically, if you even stop and think about it, it's a really difficult one to go one way or the other. So he begins with that basic dilemma, and then he goes a step further, like into what he's revealing to us is a very sophisticated thought process and encouraging us to think on this level.
Right.
To take away, like, don't let the ideology think for you. You're going to have this intellectual ideology on the left, and you're going to have this social moralism on the right. And these are too restrictive. They're restrictive to these particular areas. All of these things exist in all of us. So we need to engage all these levels within us to think about this problem in a sophisticated way. And then you're not even going to get a final answer, like you're saying, because this is such a human question. This is such a human question that you not only have to think about this in a sophisticated, critical way, the way he's encouraging us to do, and the way he reveals the thought process, I think. So the third is, it starts with the initial dilemma, then it goes into the fact that this is a woman's body and it should be her choice, and then how this does ultimately affect men as well. So all the elements are in there, and he's encouraging us to go through that kind of multi-layered thought process and end up not knowing what to do, and it being contextual and situational. That's right. I think another thing that he does is encourage that contextual way of thinking too, because if you have to unite all this complexity, if we as society again, both sides are trying to simplify these very complex things. So how are you actually going to work with this stuff in the real world? And that means that every situation needs to be deliberated upon in this sophisticated manner, in this multi-layered manner, in this multi-level manner. And then the best solution, implement the best solution you can in the situation you're in. And that means that there isn't a top-down answer to most of this stuff. That means there's a bottom-up uniting, there's a bottom-up deliberation of everything you've got, everything you've learned so far. This is the very Pirsigian model. You've got everything you know and who you are and all of your experiences. And what he's encouraging us to do is what Pirsigian encourages us to do, which is take all this material and allow the quality to rise to the top for the situation. Right. And that means that we have to become comfortable with uncertainty and trusting ourselves more and informing ourselves more. and being these agents. I don't know what John would say about. I think I better not go into the agent or regent. I better not go into that because I don't think that's right. But we become these agents of decision, because we can harness this process versus people who sit around and allow someone to tell us what to do. And this is what he's trying to get us to do.
Right. Very well said. I think that's exactly right. And I think that's why the quality, his attention to the quality, takes on a singular kind of valence, right? A singular aspect. And that's why his attention, that's why the object of his speech is not an object, it's a person, right? Mm-hmm. Right? And he has a very I-thou kind of relationship to his audience.
Totally.
And to the factions that are often so invective about him and reactive to his humor. And that's where the whole sort of transphobia thing comes into play, right? He started to refer to himself in this latest special of his as transphobic, and only the most poorly tuned radio would watch these specials and conclude that he's transphobic.
But there are an awful lot of poorly tuned radios.
There are an awful lot of poorly tuned radios. There really are. And I think it to me, what it does is it reinforces the significance of somebody like Chappelle. Mm-hmm. As an artist, because I mean, he is an artist, right? As a humorist, he has deep craft. And the reason he does that, he refers to himself as transphobic comedian Dave Chappelle, precisely to draw attention to the absurdity of the contradiction that he can attend so personally and so deeply to a transgender person qua their personhood, their individual quality, and simultaneously make all kinds of jokes about transgender people in general, precisely to show that referring to that the level of attention one gives to social collectives, to groups of people, is less real, right? It's less real, let's say almost ontologically less real than the attention paid to the singular quality of the individual, in which all of these constellating forces come into concert and become a form of personhood, right?
Yes.
And that's why the story he tells in his latest special, and boy, what a coda to his entire run of stand-up comedy over the last few years, is the story of Daphne that he tells at the end of, which I think is just, I'm very moved by it. I've watched it so many times just to try and get the rhythm of it, to really understand what he's doing, because there's some really deep craft going on in that story, especially in the marriage of pathos and humor, which is so critical, so critical. He remains humorous. It's a very tragic story, and he remains humorous about it to the end, while never losing the sincerity and the gravity of it. Mm-hmm. That's just expert. And I think it's so critical because he's showing that he is reverent toward the mystery of a person suffering, when their suffering is a consequence of them wrestling with themselves and trying to be themselves. Any individual that suffers through the task of becoming themselves, for him, is divine. It's clear, right? And that's why he has this hallowed, deep appreciation and friendship with this person, because of the fact that she's going through something that he can't fathom. And he draws a lot of humor out of the fact that he's puzzled by it. He finds it deeply mysterious. It's so foreign to the subjective character of his own experience that he cannot imagine it. And yet, it is precisely because for Daphne, to him, it is expressed in mystery. And that's why I think he finds it, that's why he loves it. That's why he clearly loves her. And that's why, for him, she is a comedian, because they share a spiritual understanding and way of understanding the mystery of the world as such. And I think the fact that he continually, while he's telling this beautiful story of this friendship with this individual, he continues to refer to himself as the transphobic comedian Dave Chappelle, to show, right, the absurdity of trying to contrast those levels of reality, those levels of social reality, as they relate to a personal relationship, and how one eclipses the other so thoroughly that it should discount any such criticism. The fact that it doesn't discount any such criticism is a frightening reflection of sort of the ideological state of things.
Absolutely.
But he has made himself so resilient, almost impervious to the slings and arrows of these ideologues, because he is a self, because he's an individual and he knows exactly who he is, and he can't. And no amount of ideological vilipending moves the needle for him, clearly, because it's not the level of reality to which he attends in the first place.
Absolutely. And for him, being in the position he's in, it's the responsible choice, because he is someone who does not have to bow to these ideologies because, for two reasons. One, because he's rich and famous, and he's never, even if he was canceled tomorrow, it wouldn't make any difference in terms of his, livelihood, in terms of his financial security. But more importantly, because he is so brilliant at this particular type of social commentary. He's so brilliant at getting in there and seeing all these nuances, like in this one person, on the social nuance of where this person is in this particular social issue, and the individual, and these other aspects of her, such as her, her vulnerability, and she's a badass too. So everything's so sophisticated, but because he can see things so clearly and in such a sophisticated way, and because he is a famous, this person who has plenty of FU money, it's his, I think that he thinks, I think it's his responsibility to society. I think he feels it's his responsibility to society to be this kind of Brujo that other people couldn't do, or if they did do it, they'd be taking real risks. And there are people who will take those risks, and kudos to them. But it's a sure thing for him. Here he is in a position that if he doesn't do it, then maybe he's morally remiss.
Right.
I can be.
It seems vocational, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I can be the agent of change in a real way, to where I'm bringing a sophistication of thought about these issues that very few people can do, because very few people have this capacity for, social analysis that he has.
Right. That's exactly it. You're right. He's positioned himself such that he's like he's an optimal pivot point around which perspectives can turn. And the humor, of course, it's because of the humor, right? It's because of the craft. It's not simply the pronunciation of the absurdity. It's the craft. It's the narrative craft with which he can do it so unsuspectingly. And I think that's it, right? And that's where the form.
Unsuspectingly, that's the word, isn't it?
It's unsuspectingly, right? Because that's right. We've been saying, like, he lures you into it. He sets you up without you knowing you're being set up, because of the incredibly natural, authentic, almost sort of unassuming way that he talks. You don't realize what's actually going on. And you really have to watch. Like, I've watched some of these specials like multiple times, and I see new stuff every time, because the game is deep. And the game is much more form, or just as much form as content. You were mentioning sort of the motifs, right? This idea that he'll bring up a joke, and he'll bring up a joke the first time, and it's not exactly clear what's going on. And then the joke will come up again, and the joke will come up again, and the joke will come up again multiple times, and it will gain meaning. It will gather meaning as it goes through the spiel. Very enigmatic. And and this idea in the Daphne story, the thing I also love is, and it goes again with this, his humor is his ironic consciousness of the paradox of that reaching up and falling back. And that's what he loves in the person. Mm-hmm. And that's what he demonstrates in himself. And that's why in his story about Daphne, one of the things that's very funny is that even while he's praising Daphne's courage and tenacity and wit, he's also poking fun at the fact that, when she opened for him, her special absolutely bombed. And he keeps saying that, right? And if you were paying close attention, you could say, well, why is he saying it over and over? Why does he keep, picking on her? It's because he's continually contrasting. He's continually pointing to this combination of failure, fundamental failure, and the courage to strive. Mm-hmm. And how when those two things are paired, this fundamental failure or, sin, you could look at it in a certain way, right? If you wanted to put a little bit more of an explicitly religious,
pardon? Missing the mark. I mean,
missing the mark. That's right. Right. He's showing how the striving and the sinning are, that there's just something deeply providential about that. And was something deeply providential about Daphne. And for that reason, that her courage, her courage to be herself and her ongoing failure within the bounds of the story itself, is something that to him contains such grace. And it's all summed up. There's this line that he gives at the end of the story, which is, it's a hilarious line, and it's incredibly poignant because what it does is it reflects the deep sense of mystery he still has toward Daphne, and in the implicit contradiction he can't help but love, even though he doesn't understand it. He's talking about, setting up a trust fund for her daughter, and that sometime in the future he'll speak to her daughter, and he says, I'll say, young lady, I knew your father, and he was a wonderful woman. Right. It's all there. It's all there in that one. It's a joke, and it's a statement of fundamental orientation. He is at home in the paradox of people. That's where he lives.
He is at home in the paradox of people. That's beautiful.
And that's what makes him Socratic. And he is at home in the paradox of people, and he loves that paradox. He loves it clearly. That's why he says, she was a comedian in her soul. She was one of me. She was like, she was right. And she was also someone who understood that sense of paradox and lived in it. And it's just, again, like taken with the proper kind of attention. I find it's not only funny, but it's moving, and it's both simultaneously. And that's why, again, the profanity comes from the profanity is effective because the profanity is emerging from the sense of sacredness, and ironically referring back to it. And there's such subtlety to that. It's a really hard thing to carry off. It's a really hard thing to carry off, regardless of the merit of any individual joke. Like some jokes are better than others, some are funnier than others, and whatnot. But that fundamental orientation is present in the form all through. And that's what you're watching for. That's what you're experiencing, is you're experiencing the formal orientation.
Okay, can you the formal orientation.
Like the way he is structuring his relationship to the material, the way he's structuring the craft of its presentation, the narrative way that it unfolds, the sort of the characterological direction of it, right? All of those things that aren't just about what he's saying, but how he's saying it and how he's sequencing it.
So it does kind of, in a way, give us an example. I think I'm repeating a little bit of what I said before, but it does give us an example of the level that we ought to strive to operate. That there are things that are keeping us from, let's just say, fulfilling something our potential as human beings, which means, and I think we mistake that for wanting to be good, let's say, whatever that means. And in this, it's like, no, you're never going to be good. You're going to, and I think this is the theme, this is roughly the theme, I think, of what has emerged in this conversation, is you're never going to be, there's always be the Yetzer Hara, which is, that's from Alan Watts. He says this is the element of irreducible rascality.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. There's always going to be the thing that makes us not God. Let's just say there will always be the flaws. And the point is, how do you deal with them? Are you going to push them under the rug? Are you going to try to theorize them away? Are you going to live in an ideological palace? Or are you going to take this muck? Are you going to, walk through the mud and, come out of this? Are you going to manage to maintain some kind of purity even in the mud?
Right. That's right. Or are you going to do the sort of the Nietzschean thing of projecting the resentment in such a way that to create demons from the implicit flaws that we share?
That's right.
Right. The implicit sin that we all share. Are you going to exteriorize it in such a way that it becomes a property of some other person or group of persons? Particularly if you're going to try and convert your own suffering into a problem that has as its object and its perpetrator someone that is external to you.
Yeah, that's right.
And he's challenging that very, very deeply and humorously. And yeah, that's right. And so much of this is happening unconsciously, right? All of this is happening usually beneath the conscious attention of anyone who's, but it's happening nonetheless. And that's what gives me, and I think that's one of the things that humor and humorists, I think, are particularly important for, is to allow this process of desacralizing dominant ideological moralizing, desacralizing it, and constantly effecting shifts in orientation, constantly disabusing us from those kinds of calcified perspectives on an ongoing basis without appearing to do it.
I like the word calcified, because I think that's where his element as this agent of change, this Brujo, the Pirsigian Brujo, the trickster that can see the bullshit, see through the bullshit, reveal it to us, make some of us angry, but ultimately update our mode of interacting with reality.
Right.
And stay with us and help us integrate it. He doesn't just he doesn't just say you all are a bunch of fools, haha, and take off. No, he stays with us.
He does.
Integrate it and has some compassion for our blindness.
Yes, and you bang on. I think that you put your finger on it. That's exactly it. Is that he's not just, that's right. He's not just, there's any contempt or condemnation, and there really isn't much. He actually is remarkably, despite all of the excoriating jokes that he sometimes makes, there's actually not all that much contempt in his humor. There's more sadness in his humor than there is contempt. And you're exactly right, because he remains compassionate toward the very failures that he is admonishing.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't see himself as separate from those. He's falling, and he wants us, and using narrative, he maneuvers himself such that he gets his audience to fall with him and become conscious of their fall as they do it.
We're all the N-word together with him.
That's right. Truly. That's it. It's funny, but that's it. That's what it is. We are.
There's I thought of something So you remember the punk? You wouldn't remember her. You're too young. But do you know about the punk rocker Patti Smith?
Yes.
So Patti Smith had a song. I don't remember which album, but the song was "Jesus is the N-word."
Doesn't that just say it all?
About it, you know, like someone, you know, the epitome of us looking to the heavens and being crucified for that. That is, and I think Pajot would say the whole human experience is in the you know, the whole experience is in the crucifixion.
Yeah.
Is being, I guess you could say, acting out that human experience, which is being the N-word and being God at the same time. And that is the whole, you know, that's who we are.
That's right.
Deal with it.
That's right. That's right. And the inmost contradiction of that. Yeah. It's such a deep mystery to us, a phenomenological mystery, a mystery like right down to the core of our you know, of our being, that it's an insoluble kind of mystery when it is expressed in any other way than symbolically or as an expression of the absurd.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, exactly.
Or as an expression of the absurd. That I love. That's a great connection that you've made. I like it, and it fits. And I think that you know, this is the level. I mean, a lot of people might say, like, boy, are you interpolating here? But I really think that it's at that level that we need to think about this. That's what's happening. Whether, you know, which is not to say that every time you watch like a really good stand-up bit, that needs to be conscious. In fact, it can't be the first time. You know, it's only with repeated viewings and attention that these things can be teased out a little bit more and that these connections become clear. But it's the spontaneous, it's the interaction between the conscious and the unconscious elements. That's why you calling him a trickster is so apropos. The Mercurius character, right? That helps to open the canal between those dimensions, right? To facilitate content to pass, you know, back and forth, and a thing that allows him and people like him to do that, really good humorists, is by the ironic distance that they already present between, you know, my sense of myself as an ego and that deeper sense of self that backgrounds it and sources it. And a good humorist already has a sense of ironic distance and non-identity between those things. And that's, I think, what allows a humorist like Chappelle to accommodate and give space for the content that surges up when he makes a joke like the Michael Jackson joke or something like that, and hold court with it properly. Because he's not going to be possessed by the sudden influences that emerge, because he's already opened an ironic distance in which these things can be interrogated properly and observed. And that's why, let's go back to the cigarette for a second.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah, I was going to.
Because that's where the cigarette comes in. Because what Chappelle does is he opens that ironic space. We can think of irony almost as a kind of space. And what happens when you smoke, right? We've talked about this before, right? It's a contemplative space that opens within a moment, right? Your relationship to time changes slightly, if only for a short period. Something is being seeded and accommodated that can't otherwise be seeded and accommodated. So when Chappelle brings a cigarette on stage and smokes it, I think what that is symbolically is it's a demonstration of the fact that he's opening a cavity within which all of these dissonances, all of these performative contradictions can pour in and take a certain shape and become conscious and become known, right?
That makes so much sense.
The duration of that cigarette, all of that can then flood in and be known and be conscious, right? And that's why the consciousness thereof provokes such incredible reactions from people, right? I mean, laughter being one, but certainly not the only one, rage and outrage being another. Because of the fact that he takes that cigarette, as it were, on stage with him, right?
Yes, beautiful. That makes so much sense. But I'm sorry.
No, please.
But he's asking us, he's saying, here is the space. Enter it with me.
Yes.
And you have the capacity for this too.
Yes. That's right. That's right.
It's in this space that you are going to be able to take all this paradox and all this mud and all this, all this grandeur, all this, the sun and the earth. You're going to be able to stand between things and put things together. It can only be in this space. It can only be in the space of contemplation.
Right. And I love the way that you bring that back to the Chautauqua, right, to Pirsigs, to formally back to these devices, and the way that you've related them back to Pirsig. Like, it's like the Brujo, that appellation is so perfect for him. And I love that you've brought it back into that, because that's a very primordial kind of role that's being played out, a necessary one.
It's easy to do with someone like Chappelle, because Chappelle is so on the money of, let's just say, the human experience, right? That was a big part of this last, that was a big concept factor. That was an enlightening moment in the last special. Daphne is having a human experience. So it's in that, it is, what is the human experience? Is it someone, dictating to you what you are going to believe? Is it this theoretical stuff? Is it going for the gut, the most biological, acting out, destructive, selfish, egoistic? Or is it taking all of these levels and all of these elements and everything? And I mean, I'm repeating myself from before, but that, that cigarette smoking, that is the space where everything comes together and the quality elements are allowed to emerge and combine into the next decision, into the thing that makes things better, into the latch that moves us forward. When we don't know how to move forward, when everything's so angering and confusing and so reductionist. How are we going to open these reductive packages and let all the,
let it burn away. Let it burn away. Yeah. How are we going to let all of that burn away in order to create from it, to create from the tensions?
Yeah.
Something real.
Yes, like that's perfect. Burn away. You've got all this stuff. Let it be revealed for the things that are of low quality. Let the low quality things burn away. Let the high quality things rise to the surface. Right.
Especially when they constellate back into the individual.
Yeah, that's right.
And when they can be related to on that basis.
So this comedian is just turning out to be one of the most, I know you think so too, one of the most important voices for the next step.
Yeah, he's critical. I think he's critical. And it sort of took me by surprise in a way. I mean, it needn't have, because I've gone back since, discovering him properly. I've gone back and familiarized myself with all of his, maybe not every last thing, but much of his work since the beginning of his career. And he's always had a lot of these qualities that we've described. He's had from the beginning. But the thing that impresses me so much is that there is a kind of transformative evolution of his craft.
Yeah.
And with every special, there's like, you can tell that he's honing it, and he's honing it, and he's honing it. And some things, the other thing about it too, is that it's it's not as though I like every last joke that he makes, and I think that's critical too.
Sure.
It's, sometimes he'll make a joke. It happened even a couple of times in The Closer, in his most recent special. It's one of, it's particularly dangerous when you go in and watch someone with such high expectations.
Right.
Because I always expect brilliance from him, and it happened a couple of times. I was watching The Closer. I thought, oh, come on, Dave, you can do better than that. And as though I know him. And
but still, you're having, that's your, you said, no, this is not the quality.
Right. But also in a way it is, because, if I expected to be pleased by everything he said and thought that I should be, that would undermine a lot of what I'm finding so important about him.
Yes.
Right. He can be disruptive to me, just as he can be disruptive to everyone else. He is disruptive, and he should be. He's a gadfly. That's what he has to be.
Yeah.
And so in retrospect, when I think back on that, I remind myself, no. If you're not happy with him all the time, that simply means that he's performing his function properly. I shouldn't be happy with him all the time. He should be as disruptive to me as he is to other people, because, because the provocation is more or less universalizable, I think, for him, right? It's not as though he's elusive in that way. He doesn't speak just from within one ideological circle, right? He flits between them. He jumps from one to the other.
Absolutely.
And he'll say things that more or less anyone in any station could find objectionable. Mm-hmm. But I think that's precisely one of the things that's important, right?
Of course. And that's something, that probably is on the surface, the first order of business for us in this political environment, this divided political environment. The most obvious thing we need to do is get in the other camp and try to figure out what's going on, rather than make grand pronouncements about them.
Right.
It's just like mediation 101, and no one seems willing to do it. That's how far gone it is.
Yeah, it is. And that's why comedy as a craft is, he's like at the vanguard of it. He's probably the certainly the most important, and arguably the greatest, at least in sort of terms of like the dominant, the more, at least of the more famous echelon. I don't know them all, of course, but of the more famous cohort of comedians. And stand-up comedy, is a very, in my eyes, and he's made this observation too, is in many ways a very American form of comedy. Other comedians, certainly stand-up comedians are produced by other countries, but it is a very, very American art form. And within his cohort, I think it's not too controversial to say that he's just clearly the kind of the best and the greatest among them, at least right now.
Yeah, I think that's what people are saying.
Yeah, and it's deserved. It's deserved. And I think the best thing that could come of that is if his influence is properly appropriated by his genre, by his art form. If he can become an exemplar, and if people can model themselves after him, not in terms of what he says, not the content of the jokes, but to model after him, the courage, for one thing.
Yeah, he is modeling the courage, very much so.
Yeah, the courage, the thoughtfulness, and the willingness to provoke, but not provoke in a sort of vapid way, not provoke for the sake of provoking, but provoking with these deep devices,
The same way he doesn't swear for the sake of swearing.
Right.
Ultimately, even, someone who is a bit put off by profanity can't argue the effectiveness of the way he uses it.
Oh, he uses it so well.
Yeah.
He really does. He really does. And sometimes he uses it to debase, because debasing is, in fact, part of the function of a joke. Right.
Yeah.
So I hope that, I think, good humorists are like probably one of the most important, it's a role whose importance I think probably can't be overestimated right now.
Right.
And the fact that it has a champion who seems equal to the task of representing the potential of that art form is, I think, a really fortunate thing. And so far seems to be, like I said, kind of for all the reasons that you said as well. He's attained to a position and a station now where he's able to be he's able to repel attempts to undermine him and attempts to discredit him and that kind of thing. And I think that's just a consequence of, yes, being successful materially, but also not being self-deceptive.
That's exactly right.
And all kinds of other comedians have capitulated to the kind of outrage that he's now facing. And I think the difference seems to be a matter of I shouldn't presume upon his character in any personal way. He's a famous figure, and I only know him from that distance. But it does seem clear that this person has a kind of constitution, a fundamental integrality as a person, that allows him not to mistake himself for the object of the accusations. And I think that's a very powerful thing. And that's something, maybe that might be the most important thing of everything to emulate. That's the quality for imitation. It's self-knowledge that goes beyond the point of susceptibility to becoming victim to the projective deceptions of other people.
That's right. And I think one of the, again, along the theme of what that has been running through this conversation, I think that the worst self-deception that someone can have is that there's any chance of ever being perfect.
Right. Exactly.
So once you accept that, and this was this is also this is very Jungian too, you have that shadow. You're always going to have it. How are you going to deal with it? It's going to be transforming. It's going to, your shadow's going to grow behind your back. You got to get in there on a regular basis and update it. You can't have this egoic stance that you're ever going to be able to refine yourself completely. This is an ongoing process all the time. It's dynamic. It's as soon as you've cleared out the mud, there's new mud. You just better be prepared for that and have the humility to accept that and the confidence that you can transform it.
That's right.
But not, that you have the transformational ability to deal with this as it's happening.
That's right.
And the more you deal with it as it's happening, the better off you're going to be. I mean, this is probably a therapy stance. The better your mechanism is for dealing with things as they arise, the better off you're going to be able to stay on the quality track.
That's right.
And so the self-deception, I think, and this is something that was a very profound understanding that John Vervaeke helped me realize, was that, self-deception is such a trap in terms of fulfilling your potential as a human being. It is just such a trap.
It is. And
so
there's a connection. And there's a connection between being disabusing oneself of self-deception on the one hand, and the capacity to wield irony on the other hand.
Yeah.
Because I don't think someone who's fundamentally self-deceptive can, in fact, be properly ironic.
I think you're absolutely right.
Because in order to advance an appearance that is knowingly at quits with what is real, requires a knowledge, to some degree at least, of what is, in order to understand what is not, in what is being presented.
And what isn't necessarily a thing you can pin down. It is just, and this is, you know what I do. Right?
I do. Yep.
What is this complex of paradoxical things, experience, these things we're experiencing all at once, and how are you going to roughly contain it so you can work with it as you're working.
Right. That sounds very therapeutic too. This idea of vessel, right?
Yeah.
That contains the process, just like the form, just like the art form that contains the process, right? Like the stand-up bit in that same way. Yeah. I think that's exactly right. That ultimately your eyes need to be fixed on the horizon somewhere, and to understand that where whatever line is drawn to stand in for that horizon is fundamentally not the horizon.
Exactly. And I mean, you're never going to be, these chess pieces are always, you don't have a bunch of fixed chess pieces that you're moving around. This is constantly, and that I think is what undergirds a lot of this angst that we have, is there's some kind of, and this is maybe one of the biggest deceptions that we operate under, is that these objects are permanent. And that we can somehow manipulate them into a configuration that will ever solve the problem.
Right. Right. Very well said. Very well said. That's a punctuation mark right there. That might just be a punctuation mark.
Well, Christopher, it's been such a delight to talk to you about this.
The pleasure is really all mine. I've been excited about it. Like I said, I was so, I think I said to you before we started recording, I was so delighted when I saw that you put out a video that broached this topic. It's not something I had heard very, very many thoughtful people talking about, and it was so my mind was so sort of profuse with that topic with him, and I'd been thinking about it so much. And the coincidence of realizing that this was something that you had observed as well and taken an interest in made me quite excited to talk to you about it.
Well, your analysis was so sophisticated. I mean, I really appreciate it, and I've learned so much from your what you've said. And and it's obvious this really means a lot to you, and you've really thought about it deeply. So the things you've said in this conversation, I mean, I'll get such pleasure out of revisiting. And you've really broadened my understanding of Chappelle's work and his importance in, our human experience.
Oh, thank you. Well, we've done it together. I think this has been, we've helped to pull, because I had some, certainly some ideas coming in, but talking with you about it, it helps. Well, it's the whole point of the dialogue like this, right? It's to flesh these things out. It's to pull them. It's to find new ways of rendering them. And I think that's been a lot of fun. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And your characteristic thoughtfulness to bear on this topic with me. It's been great.
Yes. I appreciate you. It's been really, and I've read, several analyses, and, I know I'm partial to your way of thinking, but yours is my favorite. It's brilliant. You should write, if you're writing articles anywhere, that would be a good one.
Oh, thank you very much. It's occurred to me, but it's so funny how the prospect of writing an article these days to me elicits so much less instinctive enthusiasm from me than marshaling thoughts for a conversation like this.
Well, it's recorded and it's going to be public, so there is, I guess, some variation of an article.
Exactly. So thank you so much.
Well, Christopher, it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll chat again. So hopefully we'll make the gap between now and the next chat shorter than the last one was.
Yes, let's make that happen.
Okay. All right. Well, you take care in the meantime.
All my best to you and your loved ones, and all the best for the next weeks and months coming up. And I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. And likewise. And you bet. We'll chat soon.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.